right, welcome everyone to which is probably the unofficial start of the Platypus Convention, number 9, 2017. Here at UIC, we have the pleasure of starting it. I'm Gregor, but I know almost all of you, except for a few new members in Platypus that I see. Yeah, Platypus hosts several activities here on campus. We have our Wednesday coffee breaks at 4 p.m. down here at Student Center East. Look up for the Platypus Review on the tables if you want to join us there. We also host our reading group every Tuesday at 6 p.m. down in Stevenson Hall 101. And if you're interested in joining us tomorrow, we are also hosting a panel discussion on neoliberalism and its discontents. If I'm holding to the camera, perhaps also. In this building, in the so-called Fort Dearborn room, which is sort of in the south part of that building, so if you're taking the elevator, you're wrong. You should be taking the escalators. That would be a good rule of thumb. And then on Friday, we're officially starting the Platypus Convention number 9 at the University of Chicago. If you're interested in finding out the rooms, go to platypus1917.org/IX, Roman for 9. We will be hosting, so this is sort of fitting the topic we'll be discussing today, we will be hosting a panel discussion on Marxism in the Age of Trump, featuring Chris Cotrone and a bunch of other people, August Nintz,
Lauren Goldner,
and Catherine Liu. Right? Catherine Liu. We'll be speaking tomorrow at our neoliberalism panel as well. And then on Saturday, our activities will shift over to the School of the Art Institute downtown, where we'll be having another set of exciting speakers, such as Canadian socialist Leo Panich, local queer activists Red Schulte and Yasmin Nair, and many more. And Chris will be speaking again.
On 1917.
And on 1917. So year 1 in the age of Trump, year 100, the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. So without further ado, I will hand over to Chris, who will be talking about Trump and Trumpism.
Great. So the way that I've prepared this teach-in, I'm going to present to you guys what I will be saying on the panel on Friday, and then we can sort of dive into it. So this will, it's designed to engage the other speakers on the panel on Friday night, but it can also serve as a set of kind of bullet points for us to consider a kind of general analytic thesis. I also, for those of you who were in Vienna for the European conference that took place in February, this is a version of my remarks at that Crisis of Neoliberalism panel there. All right, so the crisis of neoliberalism and Marxism in the age of Trump is my topic. The present crisis of neoliberalism is a crisis of its politics. In this way, it mirrors the birth of political neoliberalism in the Reagan-Thatcher revolution of the late 1970s and early 1980s. The economic crisis of 2007-2008 has taken 8 years to manifest as a political crisis. That political crisis was expressed by Syriza's election in Greece, Jeremy Corbyn's rise to leadership in the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, the Brexit referendum, Bernie Sanders, as well as Donald Trump's campaign for president in the United States, and now Trump's election is the most dramatic expression of this political crisis of neoliberalism. So about neoliberalism itself, it has been an unclear concept, often substituting for capitalism itself. It clarifies, however, to regard neoliberalism as politics. It is neoliberal politics that is in crisis. It is easy to mistake Trump as an anti-neoliberal politician. This is what it means to call him a right-wing populist. Presumably, then, Sanders, Corbyn, and Syriza are left-wing populist phenomena. This suggests that democracy and neoliberalism are in conflict. But neoliberalism triumphed through democracy. as demonstrated by the elections and re-elections of Thatcher, Reagan, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and Barack Obama. Neoliberalism is a form of democracy, not its opposite. If neoliberalism is in political crisis, then this is a crisis of democracy. Perhaps this is what is meant to distinguish between populism and democracy. When the outcome of democracy is undesirable, as apparently with Trump, then this is attributed to the perversion of democracy through populism, namely demagoguery. Capitalism and democracy have been in tension, if not exactly in conflict, for the entirety of its history. But capitalism has also reconstituted itself through democratic means. For instance, FDR's New Deal, to save capitalism from itself, was achieved and sustained through small d democratic politics. But that form of democratic politics experienced a crisis in the 1960s and 1970s. That crisis gave rise to neoliberalism, which found an opportunity not only in the post-1973 economic downturn, but also and perhaps especially through the crisis of the Democratic Party's New Deal coalition and its related politics. Elsewhere, such as in the UK, with the rise of Thatcher's neoliberal revolution against not only Labour, but also against the established Conservative Party, this took the same form. The same with Reagan, who had to defeat the Nixonite Republican Party as well as the Great Society Democrats. Similarly, Trump has had to defeat the neoliberal Republican Party as well as the neoliberal Democrats. Just as Marxist scholar David Harvey found it helpful to describe neoliberalism not as anti-Fordism, but rather as post-Fordism, it is necessary to consider Trump not as an anti-neoliberal, but as a post-neoliberal. There will be continuity as well as change. There will be a political realignment of mainstream liberal democratic politics, just as happened with FDR and with Reagan. The left, that is to say the Communist Party, initially called FDR a fascist, just as the New Left later called Reagan a fascist when he was elected, as if liberal democracy were collapsing rather than experiencing a political transformation. Such hysteria amounts to thinly veiled wishful thinking. The problem with the left is that its hysterics are less about society than about itself. The left cries foul when mainstream politics steals its thunder, when change happens from the right rather than through the left's own so-called revolutionary politics. Capitalism has continued and will continue through political revolutions of greater or lesser dramatic character. Avowed Marxists have failed to explain the past several transformations of capitalism. Neither the Great Depression, nor the crisis of the New Deal coalition leading to the New Left in the 60s and 70s, nor the crisis of Fordist capital that led to neoliberalism have been adequately grasped. Instead, each change was met with panic and futile denunciation. As such, the left's response has actually been affirmative. By the time the left began to try to make sense of the changes, this was done apologetically, justifying and thus legitimating in retrospect the change that had already happened. Such explanation may serve as substitute for understanding. But reconciling to change and grasping that change, albeit with hindsight, let alone taking political opportunity for change, is not the same as adequately critiquing the change. What is needed, and is indeed required, is seeing how a crisis and change may point beyond itself. What is the Trump phenomenon as an indication of possibilities beyond it? That is the question that must be asked and answered. Unfortunately, the only way the left might be posing this question now is in order to advise the Democrats on how best to defeat Trump. But this is to dodge the issue. For even if the Democrats were to defeat Trump, this might avoid but cannot erase the crisis of neoliberalism, which is not an accident of the 2016 election outcome, but a much broader and deeper phenomenon. The heritage of 20th century Marxism, that of both the old left of the 1930s and the new left of the 1960s, does not facilitate a good approach to the present crisis and possibilities for change. Worse still is the legacy of the 1980s, post-New Left, of the era of neoliberalism itself, which has scrambled to chase after events ever since Thatcher and Reagan's elections. A repetition and compounding of this failure is manifesting now around Trump's election. For instance, while David Harvey, who I mentioned, while his work from the 1980s, his book, The Condition of Postmodernity, was very acute in its diagnosis of the problem, his work from more recent years forgot his earlier insights in favor of a caricatured account of neoliberal political corruption. This played into the prevailing sentiment on the left that neoliberalism was a more or less superficial political failure that could be easily reversed by simply electing the correct Democratic Party or UK Labour politicians. More specifically, the millennial left that grew up initially against the Iraq War under George W. Bush and then continued through Occupy Wall Street under Obama, and last year got behind the Sanders campaign, is particularly ill-equipped to address Trump. It is confounded by the crisis of neoliberalism to which it had grown too accustomed in opposition. Now with Trump, it faces a new and different dilemma. This is most obvious in the inability to regard the relationship between Sanders and Trump in the common crisis of both the Republican and Democratic parties in 2015-2016. For just as the New Left, and then neoliberalism itself, expressed the crisis of the Democratic Party's New Deal coalition, Trump's election expresses the crisis of the Reagan coalition of the Republican Party. A crisis of not only neoliberalism as economic policy in particular, but also of neoconservatism and of Christian fundamentalist politics, as well as of Tea Party libertarian, constitutional constructionist conservatism. Trump represents none of these elements of the Reagan Republican heritage, but expresses the current crisis common to them all. He also expresses the crisis of Clintonism and Obamaism. So did Sanders. Marxists, so-called, and the left, more generally, have been very weak in the face of such phenomena, ever since Reagan and up through Bill Clinton's presidency. Neoliberalism was not well processed in terms of actual political possibilities. Now it is too late. Whatever opportunity neoliberalism presented is past. It was appropriate that in the Democratic Party primaries, the impulse to change was expressed by Bernie Sanders, who predated the Reagan turn. Discontent with neoliberalism found an advocate for returning to a pre-neoliberal form of politics, back to the New Deal and the Great Society. While Trump's Make America Great Again sounded like nostalgia for the 1950s, actually it was more a call for a return to the 1990s, to Clintonite neoliberal prosperity and untroubled U.S. global hegemony. In the 2016 campaign, Sanders was more the 1950s-60s style Democratic Party figure. Indeed, his apparent age and his personal style seemed to recall the 1930s, long before he was born, and not so much the New Left counterculture, whatever youthful writings of his that were dug up. What's remarkable is that Sanders invoked the very New Deal coalition Democratic Party that he had opposed as a socialist in his youth, and what had kept him independent of the Democrats when he first ran for elected office in the 1980s Reagan era, during which the Democrats were still the majority congressional party. Sanders, who had opposed the Democrats, now offered to save them by returning them to their glory days. But Trump succeeded where Sanders failed. It is only fitting that the party that led the neoliberal turn under Reagan should experience the focus of the crisis of neoliberal politics today, the Republican Party. If Sanders called for a political revolution, however vaguely defined, Trump has effected it. Trump has even declared that his campaign was not simply a candidacy for office, but a movement. His triumph is a stunning coup, not only for the Democrats, but for the Republicans as well. Where Sanders called for a groundswell of progressive Democrats, Trump won the very narrowest of possible electoral victories. Nevertheless, it was a well-calculated strategy that won the day. Trump's victory is the beginning, not the end, of a process of transforming the Republican Party, as well as mainstream politics more generally. That is his avowed goal. Steve Bannon announced that his main task was to unelect recalcitrant Republicans. Trump's economic advisor, Stephen Moore, a former neoliberal, declared to congressional Republicans that it was no longer the old Reaganite neoliberal Republican Party, but was going to be a new economic populist party. Trump said during the campaign that the Republicans should not be a conservative party, but rather a working-class party. We shall see whether and how he may or may not succeed in this aim, but he will certainly try, if only to retain the swing working-class voters he won in traditionally Democratic Party voting states, such as in the Midwest Rust Belt. Trump will seek to expand his electoral base, the base for a transformed Republican Party. The Democrats will necessarily respond in kind, competing for the same voters as well as expanding their electoral base in other ways. Is this a process of democratization? Yes and no. The question is not of more or less democracy, but rather how democracy takes shape politically. Populism is a problematic term because it expresses fundamental ambivalence about democracy itself, and so fails to clarify the issue. It is understood that new and expanded political mobilization is fraught with danger. Nonetheless, it is a fact of life for democracy, for good or for ill. The frightening specter of the angry white voters storming onto the political stage is met by the sober reality that what decided Trump's victory were voters who had previously elected Obama, the very same people. So the question is the transformation of democracy, of how liberal democratic politics is conducted by both the Democrats as well as the Republicans. This was bound to change, with or without Trump. Now, with Trump, the issue is posed point blank. There is no avoiding the crisis of neoliberalism. So those are my prepared remarks. Yes, let's open it up.
To the Q&A, I'll be handing out, passing around a sign-in sheet if you're interested in keeping up to date about future events by the Platypus Society or UIC. Just leave your email if you know you already are on that list, and we need to like double sign. So there's several sheets in case you run out of space in the first one.
Thanks for the teaching, Chris. I will have several questions, but I would like to start with what you closed your remarks of, the question of populism and democracy, and maybe open it up a bit international, because we always have this notion of the era of populism, the rise of populism, and there in Europe, Trump is linked to populist movements in Europe, and there seems to be a difference in the several strains of populism, like the Front National in France or Viktor Orban in Hungary, the alternative for Germany in Germany. So my question here is, because this touches the problem of the problematic concept of populism, where would you say is the difference in why could we say that Trump is as populist a transformer of neoliberalism, and then how far is this also true for populist movements in Europe, and how far do they differ?
All right, so well, a couple of things. One is, I would use as an example, actually, the Brexit vote and UKIP, right, the UK Independence Party of Nigel Farage, and address it that way. In other words, address it via so-called Euroscepticism or anti-EU sentiment. I'm not sure that that's really what's behind what's taking place in places like Hungary and Austria. But it does seem to be, well, it defines the Brexit vote and UKIP in the UK. It also seems to be behind the Front National in France, more so than in Eastern Europe. About Marine Le Pen, what's interesting is that she actually had to kick her father out of the party. In other words, that they did, in fact, shift and made a change in recent years, which involved kicking her father, who had founded the party, out. And then he now founded his own party. And he claims to be standing for the true spirit of the National Front, which of course he is, meaning I would say that maybe Marine Le Pen is something else. Last year, before Trump was elected, Having grown up in New York, I was familiar with Trump as a figure. And the way that I would describe it at that time was we have to distinguish between the man and the moment, meaning that Trump is what he's always been. Namely, he's always been someone who is against these free trade agreements like NAFTA. He's always been big on trying to boost manufacturing. He's always claimed to want to reinvest in the inner cities and do infrastructure. He's also always complained about how U.S. allies take advantage of the U.S. in terms of military defense. So the one thing that was new, the one thing that Trump had never said before he ran for office was on immigration. He had never raised that previously. And in fact, it's something that he was advised to take up by Jeff Sessions to distinguish himself most strongly, most sharply against the other candidates in the Republican primaries. So his commitment to it, he ran on it. His commitment to it is as a campaign promise, but it's not really, in a sense, fundamental to his politics. And he was once a Democrat. He was then a Reform Party politician with Ross Perot's Reform Party. So, but, he was not particularly successful. So there's the man, and then there's the moment. Now, in Europe, something like the Front National has been around for a very long time. And so the question is, that party, first of all, has it changed at all in recent years? Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't particularly much. But there's the moment, right? There's the crisis of the EU. And again, I would maybe distinguish between Western Europe and Eastern Europe on this count. That in Eastern Europe, the kind of nationalism that you see might be conditioned by other kinds of factors. Whereas in Western Europe, it's, I would say, coming out of the economic crisis and coming out of discontents with the EU. In other words, it's really inseparable from what gave rise to Syriza and to Podemos in Spain. Namely, the discrediting of the established parties, the discrediting of the established neoliberal parties, specifically as a function of the EU. Again, I'm not quite as familiar with what's going on either in Hungary or in Austria, but my sense there is that it's more of a kind of traditional nationalism. I would also say, and this might be a controversial point, that one distinction that I would make between Trump on the one hand and European nationalist populism, whatever you want to call it, nationalism on the other hand, would also pertain to what I just said about Eastern and Western Europe. In other words, that Britain and France, that when you define these, if you define UKIP or if you define the National Front in the same terms of the nationalism of Orban in Hungary or the right-wing party in the Freedom Party in Austria, I think that you miss something, because I think that there's something fundamentally different about nationalism in countries like the UK and France, and most especially in the United States. In other words, when we talk about what nationalism is in the United States, this is why people have to strain to come up with these new ideas like white nationalism, which I think are inaccurate. So I would tie the phenomenon in Europe into the crisis of neoliberalism. And I would say that, again, when the established parties lose legitimacy, and there seems to be a popular groundswell that produces undesirable results, then people cry populism. But that's a self-serving explanation on the part of the established political status quo.
So you talked primarily domestically. To what extent do you think the crisis of neoliberalism is the crisis of, to use the crude George H. Bush term, the New World Order, say negative part of an empire. So to what extent do you think the reemergence of this sort of crude nationalism, especially, I don't want to load the question, but I don't know how to put it, among the inter-imperialist powers as a new phenomenon that was shunned under neoliberalism, to what extent do you think that that plays into the reconfiguration of both international and domestic politics, and what does Trump mean for that reconfiguration post, I would agree, the neoliberal world order?
Okay, so there are a couple of things. I would say that we're not at the end of the post-2008 crisis and downturn, and that there are delayed and ramified effects of the financial crisis that then turned into whatever they call it, the Great Recession. And one of those effects has been the slowing of global trade, which has been commented upon in the mainstream, economic literature. So what that suggests, and for instance, the diminishing role of transnational corporations in terms of global capital, in terms of share of global capital, that suggests that capitalism will have to reconstitute itself on a different basis moving forward. Now, whether that means simply national protectionism, I don't know, because it's not clear that that's, for instance, what Brexit is about, particularly. Nor is it the case that that's really what Trump is about, meaning, Trump claims to not be a protectionist and not be anti-trade, that he's for fair trade, not free trade, and again, this is the kind of code language that people would have used in the era of neoliberalism, and perhaps it's not appropriate now because the objective circumstances have changed. And so we're not really looking backwards, we're looking forwards, meaning the era of neoliberalism showed a lot of defensive action, complaints about NAFTA, etc. And I don't think that that's what Trump represents. I don't think that he represents some last gasp of, defending some old system. Now, in terms of the New World Order, that's, I would say, a slightly different question, meaning what George Herbert Walker Bush declared in the New World Order was coming as a post-Cold War, U.S. as single superpower, global hegemon phenomenon. Do I think that that's going to change? No. And the reason that I don't think that's going to change is because I don't think anyone wants to replace the United States. I don't think that Europe wants to take over the role, and I don't think China wants to take over the role either. Now, you could imagine a situation in which they're forced to, in other words, where they have to, because the U.S. is either politically paralyzed or simply unable to perform the role that it used to play as global cop. But I think that generally speaking, not only countries like Japan want the U.S. to play the role of the global cop, but in fact China wants the U.S. to play the role of the global cop. In other words, it's not that China would want, and this is behind some of Trump's more wacky rhetoric during the campaign, by the way, when he said, that maybe it would be good for Japan and South Korea to get nuclear weapons, or maybe it would be good for Saudi Arabia to get nuclear weapons. In other words, that's a negotiating tactic. That's a way of playing hardball with China, especially with respect to North Korea. I don't think that he really wants them to do that, nor would I say that they want to do that. Right? So when we're talking about geopolitics, we're also talking about balance of forces. And I always like to point to something that the Chinese Communist Party, a report that they issued during the era of George W. Bush during the Iraq War, as a kind of current state of the global revolution or whatever by the Communist Party of China. And what they said was that they wanted the U.S. to remain the leading power, but they wanted the U.S. to act responsibly, and that they saw themselves through their, economic connection to the United States as being able to influence the course of the United States to play a more responsible role in global politics, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, I think the strategy of the Chinese Communist Party is the capitalist road to socialism via China coming up under the wings of the United States as the global leader. So in other words, I think that when China imagines that it might take the place of the U.S., I think that they imagine that in terms of global socialism. They don't imagine it in terms of replacing the U.S. as a global capitalist power. Right? It's part of their capitalist road to socialism ideology, which we may or may not give much credit to, but it at least tells us what their geopolitical orientation is. Similarly, Europe, right? So the question is, does Europe really want to replace NATO with a European defense force? I don't think that they do, actually. I think that would create more political problems in Europe than it would solve for them. So Trump knows this, And so he knows that he's in a strong negotiating position, namely that he knows that he can rearrange things to greater American advantage because the world still needs the U.S. to play this role. I mean, down the road, who knows? But I would say for the next 20 years, I don't imagine that we're going to be creeping towards World War III. You know, I don't think that Iran represents the possibility of World War III. I don't even think Russia represents the possibility of World War III, really. Because I think Russia is only concerned with its regional neighbors. I don't think that Russia really wants to challenge the U.S. at a global scale. I think that that Russia wants the U.S. not to meddle in its backyard, which is different.
And that Davos, the Chinese Prime Minister, I guess?
Yeah, who's now meeting with Trump, right, this weekend, yeah.
Yeah, she basically stood up and in front of sort of gathered of the world economy, defended sort of, said basically China from now on will be up in the face of Trump's state of protectionism and so forth, will be the major defender of free market.
Free trade.
Global free trade. So what do you make of that? What was she really saying there? If you say that, well, ultimately the strategy is pointed toward a global socialism, is that sort of a stepping stone? Or, I mean, ultimately, Chinese businesses are making a killing on the world market through various means.
It's slowing, though.
Okay.
No, in other words, China's not doing well either out of the crisis. And maybe I'd point to, there's a Marxist political economist, Hillel Tickton, who's an interesting commentator on these things. And, you know, he pointed out that the world is still dependent on the U.S. as an engine for global capitalism, and certainly China still is. And that the U.S. will remain a key site for capital investment, for global capital. Now, China, that it's going to defend. In other words, I think that his point was that China's not going to respond in kind. And also that China is not going to, you know, allow the world to retreat into national protectionism. I mean, he was, and making a case also for more connection between China and Europe, which there already is a great deal, in fact, at the level. I mean, China is a capital exporting country, you could say, now, to a certain degree. In other words, they do development in the developing world. They do investment. That's part of their orientation towards the global economy. You know, the question is whether they're going to lose their position as a kind of sweatshop manufacturing base, and whether they're already losing it.
So there's like a predominant understanding of Trump on the left, he's racist, and this understanding has like greatly influenced the kind of protests that you see even in the UK, for instance. So like immigration protests have become anti-Trump protests, and this I guess echoes what Stefan was saying earlier about how Trump is kind of being grafted onto discontents with
populism.
Yeah, this could be the rise of right-wing populism, so to speak. So right, I guess like it's just interesting how like the left's understanding in the U.S., which seems to be related to like preparing for the 2018 midterm elections, actually has like plays a role on the global level with regard to the left. I was wondering if you could speak to that, actually.
All right, so translating the Trump phenomenon in European terms, it seems rather easy, which is to say that there's a great deal of anti-immigrant sentiment in various European countries. That Brexit, they've tried to blame Brexit, the Brexit vote, the referendum outcome, on anti-immigrant sentiment. Whether that's accurate or not is really a question. And the Muslim ban is an even easier way of connecting them up, because of course what you see in Europe has significant immigration from the Muslim world, from the Middle East, in a way that the United States actually does not. And also a different kind of immigration. In other words, in the United States, what you get from the Muslim world and from the Middle East is middle-class professional immigration, whereas in Europe it's a working-class immigration. And what they're facing with respect to an immigration crisis in Europe is more similar to the Latin American immigration crisis in the United States. And there is an immigration crisis. In other words, there is an unprecedented number of illegal, undocumented, whatever you want to say, immigrants from Latin America, and that it has less the character of immigration for economic opportunity as it is kind of economic refugees from Latin America. And, that would be the analogy that I would draw. The Muslim ban seems, one way that I like to address Trump is with respect to how he sees policy. In other words, the Muslim ban and also the wall with Mexico, he sees as a government-to-government phenomenon. In other words, he sees it as a way of forcing the Mexican government to co-police the border with the United States. And he sees the Muslim ban as a way of cracking down on the way immigrants are vetted in Muslim countries. In other words, when you apply for a visa, the United States government relies upon local government to vet applicants. In other words, to do background checks. And essentially, Trump sees this as a way of pressuring those countries to handle their visa vetting differently. And it's curious, that's why they say, well, it could always be expanded, right? That's why it's more of a threat, because of course the 6 or 7 countries that were initially targeted were not countries where there's a great deal of immigrants coming anyway. So it's also a pressure tactic in other respects, meaning with Iran in particular, it's bound up with trying to renegotiate the sanctions regime. Because there actually is a great deal of crossover, especially in terms of money, right? In terms of Iranian Americans and Iranians in Iran, and so there's that aspect of it too. Now that's functioning at one level. At another level, it functions demagogically, of course. In other words, it functions as I would see it, as an extension of his general law and order conservatism. In other words, I think that the real significance of the demagogy with respect to Trump is this kind of law and order conservatism. Meaning, he's not against immigrants, but he wants them to play by the rules, and the people who vote for Trump, they claim not to be racist, but they feel that people should play fair and follow the rules and not try to game the system, et cetera, et cetera. This is the kind of sentiment that one sees. I'm tempted to be extremely cynical about the left's claims, certainly the Democratic Party's claims about Trump being a racist, just self-serving. Meaning, what they need to do is boost what was really tepid turnout in this election. In other words, what Hillary suffered from was lack of enthusiasm for her as a candidate, low turnout, relatively speaking. It was a little bit of a race to the bottom in that respect, meaning what Hillary tried to do was depress turnout of the Trump vote, and what Trump tried to do was depress the vote for Hillary. And so they need to try to turn that around. In other words, you're not going to get black people to vote for Democrats by calling Trump a racist. That's just it's not really going to work. But it's along the same lines. In other words, if they can claim to be the champions of people of color, maybe they can get turnout a little bit boosted. Maybe. But the problem with congressional midterm elections is that they always favor the Republicans anyway, because they're low turnout elections to begin with. They're low turnout elections for working class people, generally speaking. So, like local government elections in general. It's why the Republicans are able to control state legislatures and governorships. So, behind the charge of racism is a strategy that I would say is more or less desperate with respect to trying to make up for the deficit. Right. Bill Clinton might have been the first black president, but not Hillary. People understood, you know, I mean, yeah. I mean, what's interesting is that, you know, what is Hillary? She's an Illinoisan. She's in Arkansas. You know, I remember when she was running against Barack Obama in 2008, and she was downing whiskey shots in the South to try to show that she was like one of the people or whatever. And so I felt like she went a little too native in Arkansas, right? But probably the Democrats' only hope in 2018 is women. Although also Trump did pretty well among women voters. So I don't expect the Democrats to make a comeback in 2018, but they will certainly try. They will certainly try. It's it's what we're seeing, which is that, you know, Trump's going to continue to melt down the Republican Party.
Do you anticipate, like, the left to just keep saying that?
I don't imagine the left to be saying much. Are they saying much now? Like the left, like the ISO, like whomever, right? What are they saying? They're saying fight Trump, whatever, right? I mean, it's not. There's a little bit of a quandary there.
It's actually kind of stunning because usually the left, as you call it, does try to distance itself from the Democrats, but right now the rhetoric is identical. So what the left labels sort of what it's doing right now is the resistance. What Tom Perez, the new DNC chairman, labels what the Democrats are doing is the resistance. So at this point,
Nancy Pelosi is the head of the resistance.
Actually, it's Pepsi now.
What is it?
Pepsi.
Pepsi? Oh my goodness.
it's actually kind of
She has a gang name now?
There was, following the election, there was a populist challenge to Pelosi and Schumer's rule of the Democratic Party, which was, what's his name, Tim Ryan, the Ohio congressman. He actually shows up, he's very prominent in Peter Navarro's China documentary that the economic advisor to Trump, who made this documentary about China that apparently, struck Trump as,
Good.
very forceful. So now Navarro's, he used to be a Democrat until he joined the Trump administration. So Tim Ryan actually plays a very significant role there. And
He's a congressman, though.
yeah, he was labeled a centrist because Pelosi's the left. And they fended it off. I mean, they Tim Ryan got defeated pretty big, as did Keith Ellison. So it's kind of, because you said, I mean, the Democrats are planning on starting their own Tea Party, but the Tea Party
They're trying to do it now. They did it at protests.
It wasn't actually planned. It was an anti-Republican Party movement, and so I'm wondering, are they even capable of expanding the base? I mean, what would that mean?
You mean winning back the Trump
You said
voters?
The Democrats were going to be competing for the same votes that.
They're going to have to try, but whether that will happen immediately is unclear. They might have to lose again in 2020, which they will. Yeah, Trump's not going to be impeached, and he's going to be reelected. Definitely. So get ready for it. I mean, the impeachment stuff is just, it's such a fantasy. No, he's not going to be assassinated either, because nobody wants Pence. And because he's mobilized the crazies on his side. In other words, the Democrats are not, they don't really have like a deep enough pool of crazies to mobilize, that they could hope, might, that it's not going to be like a random bullet.
Greg? Oh, so this kind of goes to the domestic issue, which, it's to scoff at someone calling Trump a fascist. I mean, if you go with, the question of fascism ranges from, Horkheimer, Adorno, Arendt, to Dimitrov in the commentary, which I'm most favorable to. And of course, the idea of Trump as a fascist, everyone's seen the memes of Mussolini But that doesn't seem to actually have any historical connection to the American experience or what America sets up or what America constitutes as fascism. And many of the left will not call Trump a fascist because it means they'd have to unite with Democrats. But
well, they'd have to openly do so.
They'd have to openly do so, right? Create a populism.
Right.
But to what extent is there a possibility, given the historical foundations of both American nationalism, which I think white nationalism is unnecessary because it was there from the beginning, but also the American experience of setting up fascist dictatorships? Yes, of course, Pinochet, but one of the less talked about fascist dictatorships is Colombia, in which the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party have agreed to share power to exclude, in this case, murder the popular union. To what extent does Trump represent, perhaps not fascism, but the rise of fascism, not in the traditional European sense of the one-party strongman, but in a very European sense of a two-party shared rule of the same class?
All right, well, a couple of things that I'd say about fascism. One is we have to be clear about what we mean by it. I think that, again, why did the Communist Party call FDR a fascist when he was elected? It wasn't exactly a mistake. In other words, what they saw, the Marxist understanding of fascism is that it's a form of Bonapartism. Now, the problem is that, of course, that was around the same time that they underestimated Hitler. So they called FDR a fascist, but they also underestimated the Hitler threat. Which is to say that they called the Social Democrats fascists. So what we're really talking about is the difference between a kind of Bonapartist rule, which is more endemic, is more characteristic of the whole kind of imperialist era of capitalism, starting in the late 19th century, from fascism as a 20th century experience. Now, another way that the left goes about addressing this, which I'm more or less sympathetic to, but I see some downsides to it, is the idea that fascism per se, whether in the form of Mussolini or Hitler, has to be directed against an insurgent left. In other words, there has to be an actual threat of a socialist or communist left that needs to be put down. That without that, you don't really have fascism. Because that's, of course, what Mussolini represented, and it's also what Hitler represented. And your examples from the developing world speak more to that. So I prefer not to use the term fascism because I think it's overloaded and because it gets attached to other things which are actually unnecessary to it, like, for instance, racism. In other words, I don't think that, like Mussolini there's no racist component to Mussolini in particular. Whereas Hitler, there is the strong anti-Semitism on the one hand. On the other hand, can you really separate the Nazi anti-Semitism from the Nazi anti-communism? Can you really completely separate those? Not really. And so I think the reason that the left tends to use the term fascism is precisely for the reason that you raised, the Dimitrov. Namely, I think that the left is fighting the last war, actually 2 wars ago, meaning the 1930s. And in that respect, it's what I was speaking to in my presentation, namely that the left didn't really do a good job making sense, and Marxists didn't do a particularly good job making sense of the results of the Great Depression, nor of the crisis of what came out of the Great Depression, namely the New Deal in its various international formulations. So the developmental state in the post-colonial world, the 4 freedoms, the United Nations Charter, this kind of notion, Fordist capital. I don't think they made much good sense of that either in its origins or in its demise. And not really its demise, but rather its transformation in neoliberalism, because neoliberalism remains a kind of Fordist state. It remains a form of Bonapartism, even though there's a lot of anti-government sentiment bound up in neoliberalism. Neoliberalism still is a strong state, obviously. Okay, so that's one take on fascism. My other take on fascism, of course, comes out of the Frankfurt School, who you mentioned, namely to regard the society that we live in as essentially post-fascist, meaning that it's as fascist as it needs to be, meaning that it's really colored by the experience of fascism, but in a way that's been naturalized. So, again, that kind of strong statism is there from the 30s all the way up till now, and it continues. In other words, they're really, fascism as a movement might have been defeated in World War II, but fascism as a way of meeting a certain need in capitalism continues. And so I'd say that not only do we live under Bonapartism in the sense of the Marxist conception of what comes out of the 19th century, but we also live in something very much colored by fascism as a 20th century phenomenon. It just gets tricky because the rhetoric is so strong that it's hard to be, really precise about it in a meaningful way. And so if we can talk about it with some political precision, sure. But if we give in too much to rhetoric, then I feel like it disadvantages us more than it advantages us to discuss it as fascism. But Trump, so the title of this teaching, what is Trumpism? The interesting thing is, well, is there such a thing as Trumpism? Meaning, does anyone believe in Trumpism except Donald Trump himself, right? And maybe Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, maybe. Maybe. Because certainly Steve Bannon is not a Trumpist. He might be a kind of convert to Trumpism, a kind of late convert to Trumpism. Reince Priebus is certainly not a Trumpist, although he might be a kind of late convert in some certain respects. I think the Republicans are still trying to use Trump, but that Trump is using them. And, I always like to invoke Lenin. Whom, right? Who is using whom? Right? Who's the subject and who's the object of this politics? The Republicans, of course, want to use Trump to just, kind of continue doing what they're trying to do. But, as we've seen with Paul Ryan, with the debacle around the health care bill, or whatever you want to call it, bill, crushing defeat, right, for the Republican Party without Trump, right? So Trumpism is a work in progress, right? It doesn't really exist. Trump doesn't have a party. He doesn't have a faction of a party. He doesn't, he has voters, but voters aren't a movement. Everything's a movement. Everything's a revolution. Like in American politics, it's the Pepsi revolution, it's whatever, right? And it's like, well, no, there's no Trump organization. I mean, there is a Trump organization that exists in one floor of Trump Tower, and is notoriously threadbare, meaning it occupies rooms that aren't finished, where there are wires hanging from the ceiling. So that would be the other point with respect to fascism. Is, well, what's Trump's base? Right? He's got voters. Does that mean that he has a base in the sense of a politics? I would say no, because I think that a lot of people who voted for Trump are highly skeptical of him. I don't think that he's like a strongman, charismatic leader. I don't think that people are enthralled to him the way they were to Mussolini and Hitler. Now, other kinds of examples, like you bring up Pinochet, that's a trickier example. Because then you're talking about a military leader who makes a certain kind of appeal, but basically has the military as his base. And I don't think that Trump has the military as his base. He doesn't have the deep state, whatever you want to call it. He doesn't have the special bodies of armed men are not really for Trump. They're not, and so I'm not sure that he needs to build an organization or build a base. I think he just needs to win re-election. I mean, when we talk about the Reagan coalition, we're talking about something that's much more superficial and thin than the New Deal coalition. The New Deal coalition was a real organized, it had organized labor, it had certain capitalist industries on board, it was a much more thoroughly integrated project. The Reagan coalition is not as politically formidable as the New Deal coalition was. And I don't imagine Trump to constitute something necessarily even as coherent as the Reagan coalition. At the same time, we are experiencing some ideological changes, and there might be some changes among the way the two parties divide up the electorate. You know, so I think the future belongs to the blacks, Latinos, Muslims, and women for Trump. Like, I think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, is it really the case that the Democratic Party is just going to have a solid lock on these ethnic constituencies? Or are conservatives going to vote one way and liberals vote another way? You know, are these old constituencies going to be broken up in some way? And then we have to pay attention to ideology. Not even like class composition, because it's all more or less petty bourgeois, meaning, you know, people talk about the working class base of Trump and how it doesn't really exist, so it's more of a petty bourgeois base, but that's true of the Democrats too. In other words, if you look at the minority vote for the Democrats, it's a petty bourgeois base.
Also, sorry, this is just piggybacking off of that point, which is, sorry, is like that was one of the disagreements that kind of came up with Boris Figuritsky, between, I think, right? Like, where he was thinking like, right, like there's going to be like a reinvigoration of industrial capital in the States because of like Trump, or like.
I mean, it could very well be that there is a new boom that follows this bust. I would expect that there's going to be something along those lines, because this is in the nature of capitalism. Whether it's due to Trump's policies, I don't think that it will be. There was a boom after the 70s downturn under Reagan, but I don't think that means that Reaganomics works. It doesn't work. It's actually a question of whether the New Deal worked, or whether it was World War II that reinvigorated capitalism. You know, I wouldn't say that Keynesianism necessarily works either, right? So it's not about policies working, it's rather about the politics that, you know, takes cover under these ideologies, really. So, you know, did neoliberalism work as economics? I would say there's no reason to say that it did or it didn't. But neoliberalism did affect politics, and not only in places like the United States, but around the world. If there is, I mean, what Boris Kagarlitsky was saying is that if there is a rebound of American capitalism, and if Trump can claim credit for it and get votes for it, then it means a working class base for Trump and a real competition for a working class base between Trump and the Democrats. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I'm agnostic on that. I also think that it's tricky with respect to the Democrats. The way that it's traditionally talked about is that organized labor is the left of the Democratic Party, and the identity politics people are the center, meaning the right of the Republican Party. I would say that there are just two versions of the right in the Republican Party, meaning organized labor would have to undergo a fundamental change to represent any kind of a left force. And it's been largely defensive. I mean, despite SEIU, despite those kinds of organizing efforts, I would say that, yeah, organized labor can't simply be called the left of the Democrats. Now, was it a crisis for organized labor, the Trump election? In other words, the apocryphal tales of unions endorsing Hillary, but union members voting for Trump. That, of course, happened in various instances. I'm not sure that we could characterize the election entirely in those terms. In other words, that there was a split between the base and the leadership and the unions. I don't think it was that simple. And again, I think that the working class, the degree to which it did vote for Trump, it voted more or less as petty bourgeois anyway, whether organized or unorganized labor, and that they're skeptical. Right? It's kind of a version of the Reagan Democrats. So, you know, Clinton won back the Reagan Democrats, Obama won the so-called Reagan Democrats, and Trump kind of won them back a little bit, at least enough to get elected. So, again, I tend to think not in terms of the way the left usually thinks, which is in the background, the possibilities are understood in terms of what's possible for the Democrats. And I'm not really thinking that way. Stefan and then Ed. Yeah.
So my question goes in a very similar direction, because when we're, it seems like with Trump, there was a rise again of the category of working class.
Mm-hmm.
But when Marxists in their best times talked about the working class, they did not really only talking about the working class, but the proletariat as a politically organized class which was going to build up socialism on the basis of capitalism. So when we're talking about the repoliticization and the reshuffling of working class voters, would you say that when we see that Trump transforms politics, the political landscape in the US, is this just like a new form to the swamp? Is this just on the surface?
Mm-hmm.
And like we would say, if the revolution come around, it's going to be crushed as just some prestige? Or is this a repoliticization of the category of labor? Would this be something which Trump has just to be addressed as just another bourgeois politician? Or could it really be that the category of class is being repoliticized here?
I would be pretty skeptical of that. I would say, well, a couple of things. So the New Left came out of the New Deal coalition cracking up. The Old Left, it's a little bit of a different story. Although you could say that the New Deal with the Great Depression represented a shift in that the Republican Party was the ruling party and the Democrats were the party of opposition, and it switched to the Democrats becoming the ruling party and the Republicans becoming the party of opposition. And also, it switched, the Republicans were the liberals and the progressives, and the Democrats were the conservatives. And that switched. Now, the New Deal coalition, when it experienced its crisis, that was not caused by the New Left, but it gave rise to the New Left. I would say that two things, at least, conditioned the crisis of the New Deal coalition. One was the civil rights movement, and one could say that the civil rights movement itself was conditioned by the proletarianization of blacks in the United States, both in the South and in the North. So if you look at Montgomery, Alabama as a site for Martin Luther King, this is an industrial setting. So certainly changes in capitalism have presented political challenges for the ruling parties. And they do have to struggle to get behind them, ahead of them, to capture them in some way. These sociological, what I would call sociological changes in capitalism, which in a place like the United States, because it's so large, but also this would be true of smaller countries, also involve changing regional dynamics. In other words, what's the actual center of capitalism in the United States? It's not, Midwest manufacturing. There's manufacturing in the South. It's East Coast finance, I suppose, but it's also West Coast IT, right, and defense industry. So there are those kinds of changes that the parties have to get behind too. So the working class is only up for grabs in sociological terms. I don't think that it's up for grabs in terms of class struggle. At the same time, maybe there's a window of opportunity. In other words, maybe the crisis of neoliberalism presents an opportunity for the left if the left were to organize entirely independently of either party. And also be willing to organize independently of the way the parties polarize the electorate. In other words, that it couldn't go along with that polarization. And in that respect, a real left in the United States would not be able to write off the Republican voters. In other words, it couldn't just be a competition with the Democrats for the Democrats' voters. It would have to be really trying to get at the unpolitical people. I mean, in one of my articles around the election, I pointed out that the majority of people don't vote. So that's the largest party. Right? So of course, those people would have to be engaged, but also the degree to which people are politicized at all. I agree with what you're saying, which is that it's thin. In other words, whatever change we're talking about here is very thin. But it was thin with Reaganism too. It was thin with neoliberalism. It's not like neoliberalism really politicized. It was very thin. The New Deal coalition, on the other hand, had more substance to it, but still far less substance to it than the old socialist parties and communist parties. In terms of, the New Deal Democratic Party was a much more serious political party than the Democrats and the Republicans are today, but still not a political party in the old sense of that Marxists thought of the political party. These are not, so I think that the political transformation, I even hesitate to call it a political transformation because it's not really. What it is just a transformation, if not even the realignment of the electorate. But in this environment, again, all Trump needs are votes. He doesn't need anything but votes. He doesn't need, Wall Street to get behind him, or the Chamber of Commerce, or anything. He just needs votes, period. And that's what we're talking about. In other words, it's very thin. I think that, Bernie Sanders just this week said, the Democratic Party is horrible at organizing people. But that's assuming that they want to organize people. Organize people for what? What are you talking about? Organize? I thought this is absurd. You don't need to organize people. These parties don't need to organize people. They just need to put people on buses on election day. And so the Republicans get the churches to put people on buses, and the Democrats get unions and their ethnic constituency community leaders to put people on buses. That's not organizing. Ideologically, I would say that there's another window of opportunity, namely that the crisis of neoliberalism, the delegitimation of the parties, and any kind of realignment that goes on in the electorate also involves a kind of ideological flux, meaning people who might have thought of themselves as conservative might turn out not to be as conservative as they themselves thought they were, and people who thought of themselves as progressives may not be as progressive as they thought they were. And so that's another opportunity. But again, that's also pretty thin and very tricky. Ed?
I wanted to raise two follow-up questions, kind of on the last three questions in a way. One on Stalinism as fascism, and the other on critique of law as a category of political philosophy, you might say, as opposed to sociology. So with respect to the first, I guess I just wanted to sharpen the point a little bit, because it seems you gave a two-part answer, and you said you hesitated with the first part of defining fascism as just axiomatically a response to the left.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the second part, saying Frankfurt School, their conception of
post-fascist.
That there's a kind of just global moment of fascism that's not escaped by any particular locality. And in that respect, I guess I just wanted to see if, would you specify that as Stalinism as well, in the sense that is that part of the tricky thing about just the first part of the definition is that if you just say, well, fascism responds to the left, what that can't take on then is the transformation of
The left itself. The left
right,
itself.
into a right, and therefore that's kind of how it comes back around against the Dimitrov definition. And then with the second part, I guess I just wanted to raise a question that came out of the reading group here at UIC yesterday. Trump as potentially engaging in a petit bourgeois politics, not obviously in the Democratic Party sense of its
Republicans have their own version. There are different flavors of this, yeah.
Right, and so we talked, and I just wanted to see if you think this would be right, because we talked about, for example, military Keynesianism and infrastructure as a jobs program, that sort of thing, which is petit bourgeois, perhaps in a way that's less confusing potentially to the left, or at least in the current on the left today. But it kind of harkens back to petit bourgeois politics of the New Deal. So I was just wondering if you could kind of comment on that, more conceptually as opposed to sociologically.
All right, so with respect to Stalinism and fascism, look, the big illusion of the mid-20th century was the Convergence Thesis, right? The totalitarianism thesis is one version of that, but the Convergence Thesis, the managerial revolution, James Burnham, this kind of stuff, Shachtman, third canonism. right? The idea that what you had between Stalinism and liberal democracy were flavors of the right. I would say that that's there's a kernel of truth to it, but we have to be careful. Trotsky called Stalinism Bonapartism. Now, again, stretching the definition of the term, because in fact, maybe the Soviet Union in the 1920s was more Bonapartist in the sense that there were small capitalists and there was still a peasantry, whereas calling Stalinism Bonapartist after the liquidation of NEP capitalism and the forced collectivization of agriculture. It means Bonapartist in some other sense, and also he was trying to grasp what Stalinism was as a political phenomenon in the Soviet Union and outside of the Soviet Union. So he was talking about there how the communist parties served a similar function to the social democratic parties in terms of politically stabilizing. And that's how he understood the Popular Front. Now, you know, the kind of Max Shachtman or even Frankfurt School, like you had this with Habermas and Horkheimer, red fascism, right? Like that kind of idea. Again, it sort of stretches the meaning of the term, meaning there are superficial resemblances, and fascism did copy the left, after all. It did copy socialism and communism. And you could say that maybe the communist left responded in kind, in the sense that, you know, kind of adopted the kind of austere, militaristic kind of regimentation, whatever, this kind of civil war footing. I'm not sure what it means beyond that, though, because I think, you know, the role of the state in places like the Soviet Union versus in the advanced capitalist countries, and versus the developing capitalist countries, the post-colonial world, there are some differences. There are some differences. And so I would tread lightly on that affinity. Only because, again, what do we mean to call something fascist? Right? Now, fascism, if we're strict with it, Mussolini and Hitler, they were revolutionaries. They thought themselves as revolutionaries. Certainly Mussolini thought that fascism was more revolutionary than Marxism. He had been a Marxist, and then he decided, actually, Marxism isn't revolutionary enough, and we're going to be more revolutionary than the Marxists, right? Hitler, the Nazis, maybe not Hitler himself as much. The Nazis in general, though, had this similar kind of idea, which is that they're revolutionary. You know, they even thought themselves as anti-capitalist, right? Or they reimagined capitalism as a kind of feudalism. In other words, that they reimagined the capitalist elite. Once you get rid of the Jews, of course, they reimagine them as some kind of aristocracy. And, you know, obviously none of that, you know, really pertains to the phenomenon of communism in the 20th century. I mean, it's not, doesn't really look like that. On the other hand, okay, and here's, you know, if I want to equivocate too much, and actually I'd rather be dialectical about it, which is to say that so-called Stalinism in the Soviet Union was popular and democratic. In other words, in the period from 1928 to 1933, there is a popular upsurge against the NEP and against the old Bolsheviks. And in fact, there was a great deal of popular support for the purges. Right? That's real. So the thing is, how do we characterize that? Right? How do we characterize that? You know, I think that you have to characterize it as Horkheimer did. It's the authoritarian state. It still is, right? And you can't. The revolution can't disown the authoritarian state. Meaning, this is part of the history of the revolution, and it just is. And so the only solution for it would have been wider horizons for socialism, globally, locally, right? But that's the only solution for Stalinism. It's also the only solution for fascism. It's also the only solution for fascism. Meaning, when you're talking about fascism, the idea is that somehow liberal democracy is an alternative, and it's not. I mean, I think this came up in Vienna, namely that to imagine that we live under liberal democracy now, here, right, is a mistake as well, right? In other words, it's liberal democracy to a certain extent. To another extent, it's actually not, right? It certainly isn't like classical liberalism. It's not. We're living in some Jeffersonian liberal democracy, not at all. It's the authoritarian state, and you know, and again, it's more or less soft or hard, right? So in countries that are very desperate, it shows its hard face, and in countries where things are kept under wraps, pretty, you know, effectively, then it shows a softer face. You know, petty bourgeois. Let's talk about what you raised about that. So, all right. So here's a thought, which is to say that why, you know, how do we understand politics in capitalism? You could say that politics in capitalism requires lining up the working class and the intermediate strata of society, the petty bourgeoisie, behind the interests of the capitalists. In other words, that you need some kind of way of articulating different interests and lining them up. And so therefore, of course, while the Democrats and the Republicans are capitalist parties, parties of the Chamber of Commerce, parties of Wall Street, whatever, that they're not simply, right, that they need more support than that, at least some kind of passive assent, right? They need some kind of rallying of people, at least not to give them too much trouble, right? And so in that respect, you know, I think the Debs had this formulation back in the day, but of course it was a very polemical formulation. The formulation was that the Republicans were the capitalist party and the Democrats were the middle class party, and that the Socialist Party aimed to be the working class party. Well, that's a kind of desired goal, right? Because of course, what the Republicans were the strange combination of capitalist and working class, and what the Democrats were you know, if you call the middle class party, well, what does the middle class party mean? Especially in different parts of the country. You know, was it the party of the middle, like the white middle class in the South? You know, so petty bourgeois, you know, the question is, why do you need these constituencies? You need them at a couple of different levels. You need them for votes, but you also need them as part of the normal operation of capitalism. Right? You need them as a kind of, you know, there are these constituencies that feed into these parties in terms of providing policies and this kind of thing. I was just recently, the last election in the United States really recalled for me the 1912 election. And Theodore Roosevelt versus Taft versus Woodrow Wilson. And a live issue in that election was pensions for Civil War veterans. And the Democrats wanted to cut them off, and the Republicans wanted to sustain them. And what people don't talk about when they talk about that is, who are these Civil War veterans? And the black middle class is a huge constituency for the Republican Party, and that's who they're talking about. In other words, they're talking about, so who are the Civil War veterans who are still alive in 1912? Right? It's a thin layer, but it's a middle class black layer that actually is a Republican constituency at that point. And so again, it's kind of coded, right? And so, you know, the Republicans still stand for like the Civil War, and what that means is that they still give these people pensions, and of course, what that means is that the people would depend on them, right? So it has a penumbra kind of effect. We're not talking about so much the black working class or the black sharecroppers there. We're talking about the black middle class, the petty bourgeois, both in the North and the South. Now, nowadays, the question is, well, who is this? Who are the petty bourgeois now, right? And The Democrats definitely have a pretty good lock ideologically on the professional middle class and on the corporate middle class, on like the middle management middle class. They may not have as good a lock on the small business owner, right? The exploitation begins at home, petty bourgeoisie. Right? Those people might be Republicans. But how many of those people are left? Right? When you're talking about the middle class in the United States, you're talking about this kind of managerial class. And you know, they're steeped in this PC identity politics stuff because it makes for good corporate management. Right, and low sensitivity training for the employees. No, it's a form of labor discipline. It's a form of labor discipline. And it seems like the Democrats have a pretty solid lock on that, on like corporate America.
In terms of political imagination, like what I found very clarifying recently was when you gave the definition of petit bourgeois politics as...
Not sociological.
Yeah, but...
As a horizon of politics, right? That's a different kind of thing, though. Yeah, go ahead.
And where you call upon the state to address the crisis of society, is that kind of the essence of petit bourgeois politics, if I'm understanding it correctly?
Well, Marx's old formulation about Louis Bonaparte back in the aftermath of 1848 is that by trying to be all things to all people, by trying to unite the squabbling factions politically in society and to unite the different classes of society, that as such, he represented the petty bourgeoisie. As such, he represented the peasants, right? Even though he didn't have to necessarily represent the peasants, he shared a horizon of politics with them. All that means is that the horizon of politics is the reproduction of capitalism. That's what it means to say a petty bourgeois horizon of politics, that it doesn't actually point beyond capitalism, but only points to the reproduction of capitalism. And so it doesn't have to be small property owners, it doesn't have to be that, right? Now, when talking about intermediate strata in society, right, we are talking about the people who are actually going to make it happen, in other words, who are going to make the next phase of capitalism come about, who are going to manage that transition, right, who are going to serve this role. And so, again, that's the relationship between ideology and sociology that I would offer, is that, obviously no one is talking about getting rid of capitalism. Not Bernie Sanders, nobody. Nobody's talking about getting rid of capitalism. So the only question is, who's going to manage it? And I think it's premature to say, manage it in whose interests, right? Because Trump doesn't represent the capitalists per se. They would have been happy with Hillary, right? They would have been fine with her, excuse me. And they're gonna make the best of Trump. They're definitely gonna make the best of Trump. But it's mediated. I don't know if there's going to be I don't know that Trump is going to represent a robust form of new politics. I'm not sure that Reagan did either, right? I don't think that he has to. Ideologically, however, what will be interesting to see is how the Democrats change their colors. Or not, I don't know. And also how it flies and what it means. Because the idea that somehow the ideology that was first instantiated with the McGovern campaign in 1972, right, that this is what American democracy looks like. We look like America. The Republicans are just these old white men, and we are America. Look at us. We are America. Nothing lasts forever. Can that ideology be effective in perpetuity? No, I don't think so. Some version of the Reince-Priebus plan for the Republicans is going to be effective. Right? The idea of the diversification of the Republicans. That they should have conservatives of all flavors. Something like that is going to happen. It may not happen exactly the way he thought it was going to happen, but something like that. I think. I don't know. I don't imagine that the post-60s kind of stuff can last forever. Really, they were banking on like just birth rates or something, right? Like they were just that eventually young people will be more people of color, and so the Democrats. I just feel like, yeah, but then that will just mean that the people of color will be more ideologically diverse, and you know, that they'll become conservative. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question when I came in. You were talking about people come to realize that they're not as progressive, or some people that thought they were conservative would come to realize that they're not conservative. And I was thinking about this recently because, you know, people are trying to figure out what Trump's policies are. He's sort of throwing several things to try to outplay people right now. And so they can't figure out if he's conservative, is he like socially conservative, or is he liberally economic, like these are the terms they're using right now. And I guess I'm wondering then, how will people come to think that they're less progressive or less conservative than they are, if this has been identified with respect to policies? Now, this might happen through politics, like Trump has this idea that, oh yeah, maybe I am putting in the same policies as Obama, but he didn't know how to lead. So
Right.
This is what he says a million times in his book, is they think they can solve it with policies, but you need the leadership to make policies.
Make it work.
Politics. So,
Yep.
you know, great point. And so I guess I'm wondering, is that what you're thinking? Is that somehow conservative is going to mean some kind of politics, and whatever the new term for the opposite of that is going to mean some other kind of politics?
Well, for instance, the idea that somehow the public sector is the realm of the progressives and the private sector is the realm of the conservatives. Firstly, that's not true, because the public sector includes all sorts of crazy things like the national security state and all that stuff. And so there's that, right? But also, just in terms of like, you know, free trade versus protectionism, like all these things, right? Like that neoliberalism is like this, you know, flying wedge of the right, and then the Democrats represent the New Deal and, you know, unions and blah, blah, blah. I think that's already undergone something of a change, already going back to the 80s. But I think it could undergo a further change now. And that's what I mean when I say, you know, people will think of themselves in slightly different terms. Because just the association. I'm not sure if the Democrats even want to be the progressive party anymore. I don't know. You know, Hillary, I don't know.
Historically, progressivism in the 19-teens and 20s, or maybe even aughts already, was a reaction against the class struggle that was pretty
Yes.
strong in the United States. Right?
Yes.
So it was intended as a way of containing mass discontent by sort of ameliorating some social problems through managerial technocratic rule, i.e. it was anti-democratic and anti-Marxist for sure. In that sense, I mean, Democrats are progressive.
Well, we're not being threatened by the left, though. Like, Teddy Roosevelt was like, we need progressivism or we'll have revolution.
Right.
And I don't know, like, that's not what Bernie's saying, right? Bernie's not saying, you know, we need to head off revolution by instituting progressive policies. And certainly Trump's not saying that either.
I guess I'm saying,
Yeah.
just progressive has become sort of almost an adjective for liberal, revolutionary.
Well, right. It's a term that goes back to the New Deal. In other words, the degree to which certain things were already instituted, you know, progressive-wise by Woodrow Wilson, but also that Teddy Roosevelt, if he had been elected in 1912, he would have instituted a great deal of the New Deal already then, 20 years before it came about in the 30s. You know, certain kinds of reform regulation to make capitalism operate more smoothly. Now, right, so what's the claim, right? The neoliberal claim, we should always remember, was we're the real revolutionaries. In other words, Thatcher and Reagan and Newt Gingrich, and, you know, they were like, look, Labor, the Democrats, conservatives, we're the progressives, we're the real revolutionaries. Trump, no, right? The interesting thing is that Trump's not even saying that. And so one of the things that's different this time around is that there isn't like a new ideology. Meaning Reaganism, you know, you had kind of Milton Friedman kind ideas running in the background, and you had neoconservatism. You had this idea that both at home and abroad, you needed to fight, communism, and you needed to fight sort of aspects of the welfare state that were invidious. There isn't like an ideology that goes along with the collapse of neoliberalism. There isn't like a strong new capitalist ideology in the mix. I mean, I guess, Stefan, what you were raising in terms of like the populism, right? Eastern Europe, again, is a kind of curious case. I don't know, like Hungary, Austria, different things, because we're still dealing with the ramifications of the collapse of communism, right? That's still happening. There are still long-term ramifications there in terms of politics. Is it a new ideology, though? What would Europe be without the EU? Let's say the EU actually collapses. What would it be then? It may not be very different than it is now, actually. It may not be terribly different. I mean, that's if Marine Le Pen were to win, but I don't know. I guess she's not going to win.
But I mean, so you made a strong, I think, distinction between Eastern European and Western European countries, right? And sort of nationalism that's there as opposed to the nationalism that's in Eastern Europe. And of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union plays a big role. But I mean, at the risk of being anachronistic, isn't it time to revive classic Leninist understanding of imperialism? The difference between the nationalism of an imperialist nation, right, is one of an exclusionary border wall, right? Whereas the nationalism, admittedly a tainted nationalism of the Eastern Europeans, is a right-wing nationalism in an attempt, at its best forms, the nationalism looks like Syriza. At its worst forms, it looks like any of the nationalist parties, from Latvia down to Serbia, right? I mean, should we then I guess this works, right? Because it's 1917, right? Everything old is new again. Are we dealing with the re-emergence of imperialist conflict that is then shaping it? In that case, the emergence of Trump as, and again, I understand the loadedness of the term, right? The emergence of Trump as a fascist is not emergence of Trump as a new ideology of capitalism, but very much the interview with Mussolini where he's asked, well, what's the program? Now that you've got power in Italy, what's the program? Well, and the answer, of course, is to have power in Italy. Now that Trump is president, what's the program for Trump? Isn't it for Trump to be president?
It is, yeah. Oh, certainly, that's right. It just depends on how we interpret that. The interesting thing about Lenin's theory of imperialism, a couple of things. One is that, of course, there wasn't much border protectionism back then, before World War I. So we have a kind of peculiar situation coming after World War I, where on the one hand you have Woodrow Wilson, kind of League of Nations, system of nation states in the world, and some kind of liberal cosmopolitanism that doesn't, of course, happen. But that's the idea. In comparison to what you had before the war, which were these huge empires, but that were actually quite porous, in fact. So it could be, I think there's like pre-World War